The scream of a newborn shattered the silence of the Valente estate at 3 a.m, but it wasn't the baby's cry that stopped Domenico Valente's heart. It was the sight of a woman he'd never seen before, sitting in the rocking chair of his son's nursery, her blouse unbuttoned, cradling his infant against her bare breast with a tenderness that made something ancient and feral wake up inside him. She looked up, startled, her dark eyes wide with fear and defiance, milk still beating on her skin. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at this stranger nourishing his child, filling the role his dead wife would never fill again. And in that moment, something shifted in the universe, something that whispered mine with a certainty that terrified him. Welcome to Mafia Home Tale, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Domenico Valente ruled the underworld of southern Italy with an iron fist and a reputation for ruthlessness that made grown men weep. At 38, he'd built an empire on fear, loyalty, and calculated violence, but nothing in his arsenal of power had prepared him for the sight before him now. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she supported his son's head, her movements practiced despite her obvious nervousness. She was curvy in all the ways that made his blood heat, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and skin that glowed golden in the low lamplight. She wore a simple dress, clearly not expensive, and her feet were bare. Everything about her screamed that she didn't belong in his world of marble floors and armed guards, yet here she was, doing the one thing he couldn't do himself, keeping his son alive. His wife Isabella had died giving birth 3 months ago. Complications, the doctors had said, their voices hollow with the knowledge that failure meant consequences in the Valente family. The baby, Marco, had been struggling ever since. He refused bottles, screamed until he was hoarse, lost weight at an alarming rate. Doctors had recommended a wet nurse, but Domenico had refused, the idea of another woman nursing his son feeling like a betrayal of Isabella's memory. His mother had argued with him for weeks, his sisters had pleaded, his advisors had carefully suggested he was letting grief cloud his judgment. He'd ignored them all, stubborn in his mourning, until tonight when Marco's cries had driven him from his study to find this. The woman finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Signor Valente. Your mother, she called me. The agency sent me. I didn't mean to intrude without your permission, but the baby, he was crying so desperately, and the housekeeper said you were in an important meeting, and I thought." She trailed off, her courage apparently exhausted. Domenico's jaw clenched at the mention of his mother's interference, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene before him. Marco had stopped crying for the first time in hours, his tiny fists relaxed against her breast, his breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of a fed infant. The transformation was miraculous, and it made something crack in Domenico's chest, something that had been frozen since Isabella's funeral. "What's your name?" he demanded, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman flinched slightly. "Hannah," she said, "Hannah Cooper." American, he noted from her accent, though her Italian was decent if hesitant. She'd lived here long enough to learn the language, but not long enough to lose the cadence of her homeland. "I'm from Boston originally. I moved to Naples 2 years ago. My husband was Italian, but she paused, pain flickering across her features. He died last year. Cancer. I had our daughter 6 months ago, but another pause, longer this time, more agonizing. SIDS, 3 months ago. My body still produces milk, and the agency said families sometimes need help, so I thought I could do some good with what I have left." The parallel wasn't lost on Domenico. They'd both lost their spouses. They'd both been left with impossible holes in their lives that nothing could fill. But she'd chosen to turn her grief into something useful while he'd been drowning in his, letting his son suffer because he was too proud and too broken to accept help. The realization stung more than he wanted to admit. "How long have you been here?" he asked, forcing his voice into something closer to neutral. "About an hour," Hannah replied. "Your housekeeper, Teresa, she let me in, said to wait until you were finished with your business. But Marco was so upset, and I could hear him from the hallway, and I couldn't stand it. I know I should have asked first, but he needed help right then." Domenico's eyes dropped to his son, still peacefully nursing, one small hand now resting against Hannah's collarbone in a gesture of trust that made his throat tight. When was the last time Marco had been this calm, this content? Weeks, maybe longer. The pediatrician had warned that if he didn't start eating properly soon, they'd need to consider a feeding tube, hospitalization, interventions that would traumatize an infant already struggling to survive in a world without his mother. This woman, this stranger, had walked into his home and solved in an hour what months of money and influence couldn't fix. The power dynamic should have bothered him. In his world, owing debts was dangerous. But looking at her now, her head bent over his son with such gentle focus, he couldn't find it in himself to care about the ledger. He moved closer, his steps silent on the thick carpet, years of moving through dangerous spaces making stealth second nature. Hannah tensed as he approached but didn't pull away, didn't try to cover herself or shield the baby from him. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of her own sleepless nights and private mourning. Her hands were graceful but not pampered, the hands of someone who worked for what she had. She smelled like lavender and milk, and something sweetly feminine that made his blood heat in ways it hadn't since Isabella got sick. He ruthlessly pushed down the inappropriate response. This woman was here for his son, nothing more. The fact that he noticed the curve of her neck, the fullness of her lower lip, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, that was just his body reminding him he was still alive despite everything trying to kill him from the inside out. He's eating well, Domenico observed, his voice low to avoid disturbing the baby. Hannah nodded. He latched on immediately. He was so hungry. She looked up at him and the compassion in her eyes nearly undid him. I'm so sorry for your loss, Signor Valente. Losing a spouse, there aren't words for it. I know everyone says time heals, but sometimes time just makes the hole more permanent. You learn to live around it instead of trying to fill it. The understanding in her voice told him she wasn't just offering platitudes. She knew, really knew, what it felt like to wake up every morning to the absence of someone who should be there. For the first time since the funeral, Domenico felt seen by someone who wasn't trying to fix him or use his grief as leverage. Marco finished nursing and made a small, satisfied sound that would have been amusing in any other context. Hannah carefully shifted him to her shoulder, supporting his head with practiced ease as she began to pat his back gently, coaxing up the burp that would help him sleep comfortably. Domenico watched the ritual with something like awe. He'd been so focused on keeping his business empire from falling apart, on maintaining the fear and respect that kept his enemies at bay, that he'd neglected to learn these small, crucial acts of fatherhood. His mother and sisters had been handling Marco's care, and he'd let them because every time he looked at his son, all he saw was Isabella's absence. But watching Hannah now, he realized he'd been cheating them both, his son of a father's presence and himself of the one pure thing left in his increasingly dark world. When Marco burped and settled against her shoulder, Hannah rose from the rocking chair with fluid grace despite her curves. She moved to the crib, laying the baby down with such care that he barely stirred, already falling into the deep sleep of a well-fed infant. She pulled the soft blanket up to his chest, adjusted the mobile hanging above him so it wouldn't hit him if he moved, then stepped back with a soft sigh that sounded like relief mixed with longing. Domenico understood that sound. It was the sound of someone who'd lost their own child, finding brief peace in caring for another, knowing it could never truly fill the void, but grateful for the temporary reprieve from the ache. She turned to face him fully for the first time, and he saw her properly now. Not just as the woman feeding his son, but as a person in her own right. She was probably close to 30, with the kind of beauty that didn't rely on makeup or designer clothes. Her dress was simple, modest, clean, but not expensive. Her face was open, expressive, the kind of face that probably showed every emotion she felt whether she wanted it to or not. In his world, that kind of transparency was dangerous. People learned to school their features, to hide their thoughts behind masks of neutrality. But Hannah wore her heart in her eyes, and he could see grief there, yes, but also strength, resilience, and a stubborn sort of hope that suggested she hadn't let her losses destroy her completely. You'll stay, he said, not a request but a command softened only slightly by necessity. Marco needs you. The words came out more brusque than he intended, but Hannah didn't flinch this time. She met his eyes directly, and he saw the moment she made her decision. For how long, she asked. Until he's weaned, or until you find someone else, or until, she paused, searching his face for something he wasn't sure he was ready to show. Until you don't need me anymore. The phrasing sent heat through him that he absolutely should not be feeling. He needed her for Marco, nothing else. The fact that his body was reminding him he was a widower, not a monk, was irrelevant and inconvenient. As long as necessary, he replied, keeping his voice neutral. You'll be compensated well. The agency rate plus 50%, and you'll have a room here in the house for the nighttime feedings. His mind was already working through logistics, security clearances, background checks his people would run to make sure she was exactly who she claimed to be. He trusted no one, not in his position, but something about the way she'd cared for Marco, the genuine grief in her voice when she'd spoken of her own losses, that felt real in a way that was hard to fake. Still, he'd verify everything. In his world, trust was earned through investigation, not given freely based on instinct, no matter how compelling the instinct might be. Hannah bit her lower lip, considering. The gesture drew his attention to her mouth in a way that was absolutely inappropriate given the circumstances. I'll need to go back to my apartment for clothes and things, she said. I wasn't planning to stay when I came tonight. Of course, Domenico agreed. Tomorrow is fine. Teresa will make sure you have everything you need for tonight. He paused, something unfamiliar working its way up his throat. Thank you. For helping him when I wasn't here to do it myself. The admission of failure, however small, went against every instinct he had. Domenico Valente didn't admit weakness, didn't acknowledge gaps in his armor. But this woman had seen him at his lowest without even trying, had witnessed his inability to care for his own son, and somehow that made the words necessary. Hannah's expression softened. You were protecting him in other ways, she said gently. I'm sure you have responsibilities that keep you from being here every moment. That doesn't make you a bad father. It makes you human. The compassion in her voice was almost harder to bear than judgment would have been. He didn't want her understanding, didn't want her kindness, didn't want to feel this pull toward her that had nothing to do with Marco and everything to do with the way she looked at him like he was a person instead of a weapon. But he felt it anyway, this dangerous awareness that threatened to complicate something that should be simple and transactional. The next morning, Domenico stood in his office taking a video call with his underboss, Marco, when movement outside his window caught his eye. Hannah was in the garden with his son, sitting on a bench in the autumn sunshine, Marco cradled in her arms as she spoke to him in soft tones he couldn't hear through the glass. She'd changed into a different dress, still simple but clean and pretty, her hair pulled back in a way that exposed the elegant line of her neck. She was smiling at something Marco had done, some infant expression that she found amusing, and the sight of that smile did something dangerous to Domenico's carefully controlled composure. Boss, you listening? Marco's voice cut through his distraction. Domenico forced his attention back to the screen where his second-in-command was reviewing security reports from their operations in Rome. Yes, continue. But his eyes kept drifting back to the window, to the woman and child in the garden, to the domestic scene that felt both foreign and desperately desired. He'd had this once with Isabella, those quiet moments of family life between the violence and strategy that defined his world. He'd thought he'd never have it again, had resigned himself to raising Marco in the chaos of his empire without the softness of a mother's touch to balance the hardness required of a Valente heir. But here was Hannah, providing exactly that balance without even trying, and it made him want things he had no right to want. Over the next few days, Hannah settled into the household with surprising ease. She was quiet, respectful, kept to herself except when Marco needed her. The staff liked her immediately, charmed by her attempts to speak Italian and her willingness to help with small tasks despite not being hired as general help. Teresa, his longtime housekeeper, had taken her under wing, teaching her the layout of the house and the routines that kept the Valente household running smoothly. Domenico's mother, when she visited, had been thrilled to find Hannah installed, had hugged her like a long-lost daughter, and thanked her profusely for saving her grandson. His sisters were more cautious, protective of their brother's heart and skeptical of any woman who entered his life so soon after Isabella's death, but even they couldn't deny that Marco was thriving in ways he hadn't since birth. Domenico found himself increasingly aware of Hannah's presence in his home. He'd catch glimpses of her throughout the day, feeding Marco in the nursery, walking through the gardens with the baby in her arms, sitting in the library reading while Marco napped in a bassinet beside her. She had a voice that carried a natural warmth, and he found himself listening for it as he moved through the house, found himself timing his breaks from work to coincide with Marco's feeding schedule so he could watch them together without being obvious about it. It was pathetic, and he knew it, this growing obsession with a woman he barely knew, but he couldn't seem to stop himself from seeking out her presence like a plant seeking sunlight. 1 week after Hannah's arrival, Domenico came home early from a meeting to find her in the kitchen with Teresa, learning to make fresh pasta. Her hands were covered in flour, her dress had a dusting of it across the front, and she was laughing at something Teresa had said, her whole face lighting up in a way that stopped him in his tracks. He hadn't heard genuine laughter in this house since Isabella died. The sound of it now, bubbling up from this woman who'd suffered her own devastating losses, it reminded him that joy could exist alongside grief, that life continued even when you thought it had stopped. Hannah looked up and saw him, her laughter fatting into a soft smile that made his chest tight. "Signor Valente, we didn't expect you home so early. Teresa is teaching me to make orecchietti. I'm not very good at it yet." She held up a misshapen piece of pasta as evidence, self-deprecating humor in her eyes. Domenico moved closer, drawn despite himself. "You'll learn," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Teresa is the best teacher." His housekeeper beamed at the compliment, but his eyes were on Hannah, on the flour dusting her cheek that he wanted to brush away, on the way her dress clung to her curves in ways that made him think thoughts that were absolutely inappropriate for a man who'd hired her to care for his infant son. Later that night, unable to sleep, Domenico went to the nursery to check on Marco. He found Hannah already there, rocking his son gently as she hummed a lullaby in English. The scene was so peaceful, so perfect, that he almost turned away to avoid disturbing it. But then Hannah looked up and saw him, and instead of stopping or apologizing for her presence, she simply smiled and continued humming, as if his watching them was the most natural thing in the world. He stepped into the room, drawn by forces he couldn't name, and stood beside the rocking chair, looking down at his son's peaceful face. "He's beautiful," Hannah whispered. "He has your eyes, your mother's nose. He's going to break hearts when he's older." The thought of Marco grown, of the years stretching ahead raising him alone, it made something ache in Domenico's chest. He'd thought he'd have Isabella beside him for all of it, had imagined them growing old together, watching their children become adults. But life had other plans, cruel plans, and now he was here with a stranger who understood his grief in ways his own family couldn't because she'd lived it herself. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. You've given him back his health, his happiness. I'll never forget that." Hannah looked up at him, and the expression in her eyes was complicated, layered with things he couldn't quite read. "He's easy to love," she said simply. "Any child is when they're this small and helpless. But Marco, he's special. I can feel it." The words should have been nothing more than polite observation, but the way she said them, with such conviction and tenderness, it made Domenico's breath catch. She wasn't just doing a job. She was actually caring for his son, investing emotionally in ways that would make it hurt when she eventually left. The thought of her leaving sent an unexpected spike of panic through him. When had she become essential, not just to Marco, but to the household, to the atmosphere of his home, to his own peace of mind? He didn't know, couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but he felt the truth of it now like a weight in his chest. She'd woven herself into their lives so quickly, so thoroughly, that imagining the house without her felt wrong, felt empty in ways that had nothing to do with Isabella's absence and everything to do with Hannah's presence. He should step back, should maintain professional distance, should remember that she was hired help, not family, not friend, and absolutely not anything more. But his hand moved of its own accord, reaching out to brush the flour from her cheek that he'd noticed hours ago in the kitchen. Her skin was warm and soft under his fingers, and she sucked in a tiny breath at the contact, her eyes widening. The air between them changed, charged with something that definitely crossed professional lines. Domenico should pull away, should apologize, should do anything except what he did next, which was let his hand linger, his thumb brushing her cheekbone as he watched her pupils dilate. The moment shattered when Marco stirred, making a small fussy sound that had Hannah immediately refocusing on the baby, breaking eye contact and leaving Domenico's hand hovering in empty air. He pulled it back, shoving it in his pocket as he took a step backward. I should let you work, he said, his voice strained. If you need anything. I'll let you know, Hannah finished, her own voice slightly breathless. Thank you, Signor Valente. Domenico, he corrected before he could stop himself. If you're living in my home, caring for my son, you should call me Domenico. She looked up at him again, surprise and something warmer flickering across her features. Domenico, she repeated, and the sound of his name in her American accent, slightly hesitant but sweet, it did things to him that he absolutely could not afford to feel. He left the nursery before he did something stupid, before he said something he couldn't take back, before he crossed lines that would ruin the fragile peace his son had finally found. But as he walked back to his own room, he knew it was already too late. He was falling, had been falling since that first night when he'd seen her feeding Marco, and the only question now was how hard he was going to hit the ground when this all fell apart. The next day brought complications Domenico should have anticipated. His mother arrived for her regular visit with Marco and immediately zeroed in on the change in his demeanor. She was a sharp woman, had survived decades as a Mafia wife by learning to read people and situations with uncanny accuracy. After playing with her grandson for an hour, she cornered Domenico in his study with the kind of determined expression that meant she wasn't leaving without answers. You look at her differently, she said in Italian, dispensing with any pretense of subtlety. The American girl. You look at her the way your father looked at me before we married. Mama, Domenico started, but she waved him off. Don't insult my intelligence by denying it. I have eyes. I see how you watch her, how you find reasons to be near her. She paused, her expression softening. Isabella has been gone for 3 months, mio figlio. You're allowed to feel alive again. The words hit harder than any accusation. Was that what this was, feeling alive again after months of numbness? Or was it something more complicated, something tangled up with grief and guilt and the dangerous pull of a woman who understood loss because she'd lived it? I hired her for Marco, he said, but the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. His mother smiled knowingly. Of course you did, but Marco is not why you can't stop thinking about her. Before Domenico could respond, Teresa appeared in the doorway looking worried. Signor Valente, there's a man here to see Signora Hannah. He says he's her brother-in-law, that he needs to speak with her urgently. The protective instinct that rose in Domenico was immediate and fierce. Where is she? In the garden with Marco. I didn't want to bring the man to her without checking with you first. Smart, Domenico approved. Show him to the receiving room. I'll speak with him first. His mother raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as he strode past her, already pulling out his phone to text his head of security for a quick background check on whoever this man was and what he wanted with Hannah. The man waiting in the receiving room was in his late 30s, dressed in an expensive suit that didn't quite hide the desperation in his eyes. He stood when Domenico entered, recognition and fear flickering across his features. Signor Valente, I apologize for coming to your home unannounced. I'm Michael Cooper, Hannah's brother-in-law. I need to speak with her about a family matter. Domenico remained standing, using his height and presence to dominate the space in ways that made lesser men nervous. What kind of family matter? Michael shifted uncomfortably. It's personal, sir. I'd rather discuss it with Hannah directly. The possessiveness that surged through Domenico had no logical basis, but that didn't make it any less real. Anything concerning someone living under my protection is my business, he said coldly. You'll tell me what you want with her, or you'll leave without seeing her at all. The threat was clear, and Michael paled slightly before nodding. It's about my brother's estate, he said. There's a life insurance policy that names Hannah as beneficiary, a substantial one. The company has been difficult about paying out, claiming they need her signature on additional paperwork, but she hasn't been responding to their letters. That's because she doesn't live at her old address anymore, Domenico pointed out. Why not contact her directly? I tried, Michael said. Her phone number is disconnected, and the agency wouldn't give me information about where she was working. It took me weeks to track her down here. The alarm bells in Domenico's head were ringing loudly now. His security team should have found this information when they vetted Hannah, should have flagged the insurance situation as potential leverage someone could use against her. The fact that Michael had tracked her to his home meant either his brother-in-law was more resourceful than he looked or someone had helped him, and neither option was acceptable. I'll pass along your message, Domenico said flatly. If she wants to contact you, she will. Michael's face tightened. The policy is for 2 million euros, Signor Valente. Hannah deserves that money. It's what my brother would have wanted. The amount was substantial enough to change Hannah's life completely, to make her financially independent in ways that would mean she no longer needed this job, no longer needed to stay in his home, no longer needed him. The possessive voice in Domenico's head that had been growing stronger by the day didn't like that thought at all. I said I'll pass along the message, he repeated, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Michael left, but not before glancing nervously at the guards who'd materialized to escort him out. Domenico found Hannah in the garden exactly where Teresa had said, sitting on a bench with Marco sleeping peacefully in her arms. She looked up as he approached, and her smile faltered at whatever she saw in his expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "You had a visitor," Domenico said, watching her face carefully. "Michael Cooper, your brother-in-law." All the color drained from Hannah's face. She instinctively held Marco closer, as if the baby could protect her from whatever was coming. "What did he want?" she whispered. "He says there's a life insurance policy from your husband's death," Domenico continued. 2 million euros with you as beneficiary. He wants you to sign paperwork so the company will pay out. Hannah's hands were shaking now. And Domenico's protective instincts roared to life at the sight of her fear. "That's not about insurance," she said quietly. "That's about control." Her voice dropped even lower. "My husband's family never approved of me. They thought he married beneath him, an American with no connections, no money. When he got sick, they tried to convince him to change his will, to leave everything to his parents instead of me. He refused, and she paused, swallowing hard. They made my last months with him hell. After he died, after I lost the baby, they kept showing up, demanding I sign papers giving up my rights to his estate. I disconnected my phone and moved to avoid them." The picture clarified in Domenico's mind, and with it came a fury that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the woman sitting before him. Her in-laws had harassed a grieving widow, had tried to steal her husband's legacy, had driven her into hiding. The fact that they'd now tracked her to his home meant they were more desperate or more dangerous than Hannah realized. "You should have told me this during the background check," he said, gentler than he'd intended. "My people need to know about potential threats." Hannah looked up at him with exhausted eyes. "I didn't think they'd find me here. I thought," she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I'll leave if my being here puts Marco in danger." The immediate rejection of that idea was visceral. "You're not going anywhere," Domenico said firmly. "No one is taking you from this house, and no one is forcing you to sign anything you don't want to sign. If your husband left you that money, it's yours. If his family has a problem with that, they'll have a bigger problem with me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice seemed to surprise them both. Hannah stared at him with wide eyes, something complicated working across her features. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you protect me like this? We barely know each other." "Because you're under my roof, caring for my son, and that makes you my responsibility," Domenico said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't the complete truth. The real answer was more complicated, more dangerous, had to do with the way she made him feel alive again and the way he'd lie, cheat, and kill to keep her safe. But he couldn't say that, couldn't admit to feelings that had no business existing 3 months after burying his wife. So he offered her the explanation that made sense in his world, instead of the one that made sense in his heart. That evening, Domenico called a meeting with his security team in his study. His head of security, Antonio, spread out files on the desk detailing everything they'd found on the Cooper family in the hours since Michael's visit. The insurance policy was real, legitimately owed to Hannah, but the paperwork Michael claimed was needed didn't exist according to the insurance company. They'd already approved the payout weeks ago and had been trying to contact Hannah to arrange transfer. Michael and his parents had been attempting to intercept the money by claiming they were handling Hannah's affairs on her behalf, using forged power of attorney documents that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. "So they're trying to steal from her," Domenico confirmed, his voice dangerously quiet. Antonio nodded. "The family has debts, Signor. The father gambled away most of their assets. They're desperate, which makes them unpredictable. They might try something more aggressive if they think she's blocked access to the money." The protective fury that rose in Domenico was all-consuming. "Increase security on the house," he ordered. No one gets near Hannah or Marco without explicit clearance from me. And make it very clear to the Cooper family that Hannah is under Valent protection now. If they want to try to intimidate her, they'll have to go through me first. After Antonio left to implement the new protocols, Domenico's mother appeared in the doorway. She'd been staying for dinner and had clearly been listening to enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. You're claiming her publicly, she observed. As what exactly? An employee under your protection or something more? Domenico poured himself a drink, using the time to choose his words carefully. She's Marco's caretaker, he said. That makes her important to this family. His mother's smile was knowing. She's important to you, she corrected. And before you deny it, know that I'm not condemning you. Isabella would want you to live, to love again. She would want Marco to have a mother figure. But you need to be honest with yourself about what you're feeling before you can be honest with Hannah. The truth of her words settled over him like a weight. He'd been lying to himself for days now, pretending his interest in Hannah was purely practical, purely about Marco's needs. But that didn't explain the jealousy he'd felt when he'd learned another man had come looking for her. It didn't explain the way he found excuses to be near her, the way he listened for her voice, the way he couldn't stop thinking about the softness of her skin under his fingers when he'd brushed the flour from her cheek. It didn't explain why the thought of her leaving made him feel like he was drowning all over again. The following morning, Domenico found Hannah in the library feeding Marco. She looked up when he entered and he saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. Did you mean what you said yesterday about protecting me from my in-laws? Domenico moved closer, drawn as always by her presence. I meant every word, he confirmed. No one threatens what's mine. The possessive phrasing was deliberate this time, a test to see how she'd react. Hannah's breath hitched slightly. I'm not yours, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I work for you. That's different. Is it? Domenico challenged, moving even closer until he could see the rapid pulse in her throat. Because from where I'm standing, you've become essential to my household, to my son, to me, in ways that have nothing to do with employment contracts. Hannah's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Domenico, she whispered, I'm not Isabella. I can't replace her. I don't want you to replace her, he said fiercely. I want you to be yourself, to stay here not because you're being paid, but because you choose to. I want to wake up knowing you're under my roof. I want to watch my son thrive under your care. He stopped, the confession caught in his throat. What do you want? Hannah pressed, and the invitation in her eyes was unmistakable. Domenico's control, already frayed, snapped completely. He cupped her face in both hands, giving her time to pull away, to refuse, to remind him of all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But she didn't move except to lean into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as if savoring the contact. When she opened them again, the heat he saw there matched his own. I want you, he admitted roughly. I want you in ways I have no right to want, in ways I tried to deny. But I'm done lying to myself. You've been driving me insane since the first night I saw you. Hannah's free hand came up to rest against his chest, right over his heart. She could probably feel how hard it was racing. I've been trying not to feel this, she confessed. Trying to tell myself it's too soon for both of us, that it's inappropriate, that I should leave before it gets complicated. But it's already complicated, isn't it? Domenico nodded, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone, impossibly complicated. But I don't care. I want you anyway. Want us, whatever that might look like. He paused, needing her to understand. I can't promise it will be easy. My world is dangerous. There are enemies who would use you against me, but I can promise I'll protect you with everything I have. I'll never let anyone hurt you or Marco again. The fierce protectiveness in his voice seemed to undo something in Hannah. She leaned up, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was both tentative and hungry. Domenico made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, pouring months of loneliness and grief and desperate need into the contact. Hannah responded with equal fervor, her hand fisting in his shirt as if to anchor herself. The kiss would have gone further if Marco hadn't chosen that moment to finish eating and demand attention with a small cry of protest at being ignored. They broke apart, both breathing hard, and Hannah looked down at the baby with a soft laugh. He has terrible timing, she said. Domenico smiled despite the ache of interrupted desire. He's my son. Impeccable timing for causing trouble is apparently genetic. Hannah laughed again, the sound doing dangerous things to his already compromised control, and carefully shifted Marco to her shoulder for burping. Domenico watched the practiced motion, watched her care for his son with such natural affection, and felt something settle in his chest. This was right. She was right. They were right in ways that transcended logic or timing or any of the reasons this shouldn't work. Over the next week, something shifted in the house. Domenico stopped pretending he wasn't pursuing Hannah, and she stopped pretending she didn't welcome it. There were touches now, casual and deliberate, his hand on her lower back as they walked through the house, her fingers brushing his when she handed him Marco, stolen kisses in the hallway when no one was looking. His mother and sisters noticed, of course, and while his sisters remained cautious, his mother was thrilled, had already started making noises about grandchildren and weddings and the house needing life again. But the peace was shattered when Antonio came to Domenico's study with an urgent report. The Cooper family had tried to enter the property, he said. Michael and his father both. They were claiming they had legal right to see Hannah, demanding we turn her over to them for questioning about the insurance fraud they're accusing her of committing. The absurdity of the accusation would have been funny if it weren't so clearly a desperate attempt to intimidate Hannah into signing away her rights. "Where are they now?" Domenico demanded, already standing. "At the front gate," Antonio replied. "I've got 4 men holding them there until you decide how to handle it." Domenico's jaw clenched with barely contained fury. "I'll handle it personally." He found Hannah in the nursery with Marco, and the fear in her eyes when he told her what was happening broke something in him. "I won't let them take you," he promised. "I won't even let them speak to you if you don't want them to. But I need to know what you want me to do. Do you want to face them with me backing you up, or do you want me to send them away?" Hannah looked down at Marco, then back up at Domenico with new steel in her eyes. "I want to face them," she said. "I want them to know I'm not alone anymore, that they can't bully me into giving up what's rightfully mine. She paused, then continued with growing confidence. "I want them to know I'm under your protection, and if they have a problem with that, they can take it up with you." The fierce pride in her voice made Domenico want to kiss her senseless, but that would have to wait. He offered her his arm instead. "Then let's go show them exactly who they're dealing with now." The confrontation at the gate was brief, but effective. Michael and his father, Thomas Cooper, both paled when they saw Domenico approaching with Hannah on his arm. Domenico let them see his face, let them recognize exactly who they were trying to intimidate, and watched the fear set in. "Signora Cooper is under Valent protection," he said coldly, using the title she'd earned as a widow even if her in-laws wanted to strip her of it. "Any attempt to contact her, harass her, or interfere with her life in any way will be considered a personal offense against my family. Do I make myself clear?" Thomas tried to bluster. "She's family. We have a right." "You have no rights," Domenico interrupted, his voice dropping into the dangerous register that made grown men weep. "She's not your family anymore. She's mine." The claim was public, undeniable, and from the shock on the Cooper men's faces, completely unexpected. "And if you try to touch what's mine again, you'll learn exactly what happens to people who threaten the Valent family. It's not a lesson you'll survive." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Michael and Thomas exchanged glances, and Domenico could see the moment they realized they'd miscalculated badly, had thought they were dealing with a helpless woman, and had instead walked into the territory of one of the most dangerous men in Italy. "We will leave her alone," Thomas stammered. "The insurance, the estate, she can have it. We won't contest it." "Smart decision," Domenico said. "Now leave my property before I decide that letting you leave at all is too generous." The Cooper men practically ran back to their car, and Domenico watched until they were out of sight before turning to Hannah. She was shaking, but not from fear. From relief, from vindication, from the realization that she'd finally stood up to the people who'd made her life hell and won. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing with me, for claiming me like that." Domenico pulled her close, uncaring that his guards were watching. "I meant every word," he said against her hair. "You're mine now, Hannah, in every way that matters. And I protect what's mine." The possessiveness should probably have bothered her, should have felt like just another form of control. But the way she melted against him, the way her arms wrapped around his waist, told him she understood the difference. This wasn't about ownership. This was about partnership, about choosing each other, about building something new from the ashes of what they'd both lost. That night, after Marco was asleep and the house was quiet, Domenico found Hannah on the terrace overlooking the garden. She turned when she heard him approach, and the look in her eyes was clear invitation. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she didn't move away. Instead, she reached for him, pulling him close with a hunger that matched his own. The kiss that followed was explosive, months of tension and denial finally given permission to burn. Domenico backed her against the terrace wall, his hands spanning her waist as he deepened the kiss, until she was making small, desperate sounds that drove him wild. "We should stop," he managed to say, even though stopping was the last thing he wanted. "We should take this slow, do it right." Hannah pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I don't want slow," she said. "I want you. I want this. I want to stop being afraid and start living again." Her hands found the buttons of his shirt. "Unless you don't want," Domenico cut off her uncertainty with another searing kiss. "I want," he confirmed roughly. "God, Hannah, I want you so much it's killing me." "Then take me," she whispered. "Take me and make me forget everything except this." He swept her into his arms and carried her to his bedroom, the one he'd avoided since Isabella's death, the one he'd thought he'd never share with anyone again. But with Hannah in his arms, soft and willing and looking at him like he was her salvation instead of her employer, the ghosts didn't matter anymore. Only this mattered, only she mattered, only the way she gasped his name as he laid her on the bed and showed her exactly how much he wanted her, needed her, loved her. The night stretched out in hours of rediscovery, of learning each other's bodies and hearts, of erasing the loneliness they'd both carried for too long. When dawn broke, Domenico woke with Hannah curled against his chest, her dark hair spread across his pillow, one hand resting over his heart. He watched her sleep and felt something he hadn't felt in months, peace. But when she woke and saw where she was, panic flickered across her features. "I should go," she said, trying to pull away. "Before someone sees, before this gets complicated." Domenico tightened his arms around her. "It's already complicated," he reminded her, "and I don't care who sees. I want them to see. I want everyone to know you're mine." Hannah bit her lip, uncertainty warring with desire. "What about Isabella?" she asked quietly. "What about people thinking it's too soon, that I'm replacing her?" Domenico cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're not replacing anyone," he said firmly. "What Isabella and I had was real and important and part of my past. But you're my future if you'll have me. I love you, Hannah. I know it's fast, I know it's probably insane, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you and I want you in my life, in Marco's life. Not as an employee, but as my partner, my love, my everything." Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks. "I love you too," she confessed. "I tried to keep it professional, but I fell for you anyway. Fell for your strength and your vulnerability and the way you love your son. Fell for the man you are when you let your guard down. I love you, Domenico, and it terrifies me because I've already lost so much." The fear in her voice broke his heart. "I can't promise you won't ever hurt," he said honestly. "Life is cruel sometimes, and my world especially so. But I can promise I'll fight for us every single day. I'll protect you and Marco with everything I have. And I'll love you, fiercely and completely, for as long as you'll let me." The next few months were a study in learning to blend their lives completely. Hannah moved from the guest quarters to Domenico's bedroom, and the household adjusted with surprising ease. His mother was thrilled. His sisters warmed up once they saw how happy Hannah made him, and Marco thrived with both a father and a mother figure fully present in his life. The insurance money finally came through, and Hannah donated a portion to Sid's research and invested the rest, her financial independence secured in ways her in-laws had tried to prevent. But true peace only came after Domenico made it official. 6 months after that first night when Hannah had walked into his life feeding his son, he proposed in the garden where he'd first realized he was falling for her. The wedding was small, family only, held in the chapel on the estate grounds. Hannah wore ivory lace and carried roses, and when Domenico saw her walking toward him, his breath caught at the sheer rightness of the moment. This woman, this fierce, compassionate, beautiful woman, had chosen him and his complicated, dangerous life, had chosen to be Marco's mother and his wife and his partner in everything that mattered. The priest spoke the traditional vows, but Domenico added his own. "I promise to protect you and cherish you and love you every day for the rest of our lives," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I promise to be the man you deserve, the father Marco deserves, the husband who makes you feel safe and loved and valued. You saved my son, but Hannah, you saved me too. You brought light back into my life when I thought I'd live in darkness forever. I love you, and I'll spend forever proving it. Hannah's own vows were equally emotional. I promise to stand beside you in joy and in sorrow, in peace and in chaos, she said. I promise to love Marco as my own son, to be the mother he needs and the partner you deserve. You showed me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that love can bloom even in the darkest seasons. I love you, Domenico, and I choose you and Marco and this life we're building, every single day. When the priest declared them married and Domenico kissed his bride, the applause from their small gathering of family seemed to echo with approval not just from the living, but from those they'd lost, Isabella and Hannah's husband both, giving their blessing to this new beginning built from ashes and hope. A year later, Hannah stood in the garden holding their daughter, Sophia, while Marco toddled beside them chasing butterflies. Domenico watched from the terrace, his heart so full it ached. He'd thought his life was over when Isabella died, thought he'd never feel joy again. But Hannah had proven him wrong in the most beautiful way possible. She'd brought healing and love and laughter back into his home. She'd given Marco a mother and him a wife and their family a future that honored the past while embracing the present. Hannah looked up and caught him watching, and the smile she gave him was pure sunshine. He crossed the garden to his family, pulling both his children into his arms and kissing his wife with all the love and gratitude he felt for her presence in his life. This was what mattered. Not the empire he'd built or the power he wielded or the fear he commanded. Just this, his wife and children in the garden on a perfect autumn day, safe and loved and whole. Hannah had texted the wrong number once and found a dangerous man who became her salvation. Domenico had found a stranger feeding his son and discovered his second chance at love. Together, they'd built something beautiful from loss and longing, and he knew with absolute certainty that he'd burn the world down before he'd let anything threaten this family ever again. The red peppers still hung by every door, protection and tradition intertwined, but now they meant something more. They meant home. They meant family. They meant love conquering grief and hope defeating despair. They meant a widowed mafia boss and a heartbroken nurse had found each other in the darkest moment and built a light strong enough to last forever. And when Sophia grew old enough to ask about the peppers, Hannah would tell her about her grandmother Maria and the traditions that bound them. But Domenico would add his own truth, that the best protection wasn't superstition or tradition, but the fierce love of family willing to fight for each other against any threat. That was the legacy he wanted for his children, the knowledge that love, real love, was worth any price and strong enough to survive any storm.